Hello and welcome to Learn Page by Page. I'm Sally, and in this video I'm going to cover negative numbers. I'm going to go right from the basics, assuming you might not be familiar with working with negative numbers, but I am going to cover some more advanced skills and also define the rules and the reasons why certain rules apply to negative numbers. You'll find that even if you're quite far ahead in maths, but you're still getting the occasional question wrong, there could be 1 or 2 points regarding negative numbers that will be worth you reviewing. So let's dive straight in. If you have a look on the right hand side here, if you have a positive, multiply or divide by a negative, then the answer is a negative. Going back to me saying multiply or divide, the key thing to remember here is multiplication and division, they're just the undoing, they're the opposites of each other. So the rule here applies to both. If we look at the second rule, we had a negative multiplied by a positive, again that's a negative. And then a positive multiply or divide by a positive, that's a positive. And lastly, this is the quite bizarre one, a negative multiply or divided by a negative, the answer will always be positive. Now these are the 4 rules, but if you can identify when the signs are different, the answer is always a negative, and when the signs are the same, the answer is always positive. Then you can just write these simplified rules down here, because the last thing you want to be doing is sat in an exam frozen trying to remember these rules. And the same, if you struggle adding or subtracting negative numbers, then use a number line. And then you can always refer back to it. So let's start over here on the left, and we're going to work through the multiplication. So the very first question, 2 multiplied by negative 3. Even though there's not a sign in front of the 2, you always assume there's a positive. So that's a positive 2 multiplied by a negative 3. The first thing you should do is do the signs first, and if we come over to what our rules said, we saw that a positive multiplied by a negative gave us a negative. So that will equal, we do the sign first, negative, and 2 multiplied by 3 is 6. Then on to the next question, negative 4 multiplied by positive 5. Have a look over on the rules, you'll see that a negative multiplied by a positive gives you a negative. Do the signs first. Negative multiplied by a positive is a negative, and 4 times 5 is 20. The next one, a negative 6 multiplied by a negative 2. You'll notice I separate the multiplication with a bracket, and that is because you can't have 2 signs next to each other. So if I had written minus 6 multiplied by negative 2, mathematically that wouldn't be correct. You should always separate 2 signs with brackets. So now we can go ahead and solve. And you remember we had this negative and this negative. If you come over to the rules, you see a negative multiplied by a negative is a positive. We don't write the positive in, so we just go 6 times 2, that gives us 12. With the next question, you can see it's the same. We have a negative 6 and a negative 2, but I haven't included a sign here, and that is because there is an invisible multiplication sign there. So whatever you have next to a bracket, be it a number, a letter as in algebra, a symbol as in pi with circle work, there's always an invisible multiplication sign. And what this question then is asking you to do is multiply by whatever is in the bracket. So it's asking us to multiply negative 6 by negative 2. And as that's the same as above, we've got a positive, and that's a 12. We have the same example here with 3x. Nothing there, so we know there's an invisible multiplication sign and a negative 4 inside the bracket. This is a positive 3x, so if we do our sign first, positive multiplied by a negative, the signs are different, that gives you a negative. Then 3x multiplied by 4, that would give you 12x. We have another algebra one, and it's asking us to multiply by a negative third. So we have negative 2x multiplied by negative third. Over to your rules. Now let's look at the simplified rules here. We can see that a negative multiplied by a negative is a positive. Remember, if the signs are the same, it's always a positive. Then we have 2x multiplied by a third is 2 over 3, and we're working with algebra, so that's 2/3 x. Now over to divide, and exactly the same rules apply with divide. If you want to pause the video and try these for yourself, go ahead now, okay? And let's work through them. The first one, we have a positive 4. Remember, there's an invisible plus there. Divided by a negative 2. Check with the rules. Positive divided by a negative is a negative. Sign first, negative. 4 divided by 2 is 2. That gives you -2. Next one, here again you can see I've separated with a bracket. And so therefore we have a negative divided by another negative. That would give us a positive. And 12 divided by 6, that's +2. Next one, same again. A negative divided by a negative, and that would be a positive. 49 divided by 7, that's 7. I kept that in because it's your square number, 7 sevens are 49. It's something that's always worth remembering. And then here's another algebra one. We have a positive 18x divided by a negative 9x. Let's do the sign first. A positive and a negative, the signs are different. It has to be a negative. Then 18 divided by 9 is 2. Don't forget we're working with algebra, so it's 2x. Another fraction one, positive half divided by negative 2. So signs are different, has to be a negative. And then a half divided by 2, well, that's a quarter. Negative divided by a positive, again the signs are different. That gives us a negative. And then we have 2 divided by 3. And the way we would write this, we'd write this as a fraction. And 2 over 3. One thing I want to point out here is when you write a fraction like this, make sure that you put the sign here in the middle of the two numbers. Don't do this. That's not mathematically correct. That's not how we present our answer. Because if you think about this, well, what do you have? You have -2, and look at a fraction line, like a division line, divided by +3. And so you haven't, in theory, answered the question. It's more mathematically correct to present your answer like this. That's the correct way. Next, we move on to adding and subtracting negative numbers. This you would think should be easier. Part of it, yes, but there are areas that can trip you up. So you'll notice I've brought the rules over. The signs are different. It's a negative. If they're the same, it's a positive. And I'd even go so far as to write that down for you. Now let's move on to the questions. So the first two I've included here, 8 take away 3 and -3 plus 8. You look at them and you're probably thinking, ridiculously easy, especially the first one. And yes, they are, but there is a rule that applies. First of all, if we look at the 8 take away 3, we know that equals 5. And then the -3 plus 8. Well, here, if you struggle at all with negative numbers, this is where you would use a number line. And you would start at -3, and you need to add on 8. And from there, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that brings you to +5. And you notice it's exactly the same answer as above. And that is because this 8 here is exactly the same as that 8. And this -3 is just the same as this -3. So it doesn't matter what way round you add or subtract a negative and a positive number. And that is your first rule. So you see you have adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive. Now we move on to the next question. Here we have a -5 minus a -4. Now you notice I say negative when I'm speaking about the value of the numbers, but when I'm speaking about the mathematical operation, subtracting, I'll say minus. And that's a good habit to get into. So let's have a look at these two signs and this separating bracket. Again, the rule of having two signs next to each other that you can't do, you have to separate them by a bracket. So if I had written that as -5 minus -4 with no bracket, that would be wrong. You must separate with a bracket. And when you separate this with a bracket, what you've inadvertently done is you've put an invisible multiplication sign there. So just like when we were multiplying and dividing before, that bracket is telling you to multiply everything by -4. What we're multiplying here is we're multiplying the sign. Don't get confused with the -5. It has nothing to do at this stage. And so what I would advise you to do here is always rewrite the question. So the -5, that stays the same. Now we have a negative multiplied by a negative. And as we know, when the signs are different, it's a positive. Rewrite that as plus and it's 4. Now we can go ahead and answer. Again, use the number line if you need to. So -5 plus 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, brings you to -1. Next question, we have -2 plus -7. So we rewrite -2 and the plus and the minus. Again, you're being told to multiply. The signs are different, therefore we have a -7. Use a number line if you need to. For now, I'll go ahead and write the answer, -9. Similar, but here we have a +6. That stays the same, nothing's happened there. And the positive and the negative, that will become a -1 equals 5. And lastly, we have 4 minus -3. Those two signs, they're going to become a positive, 4 plus 3. So if we look here, I've drawn an ice cube, and that ice cube at the moment, the temperature is -3 degrees centigrade, and I want to melt it. I couldn't draw a puddle that well, I'm afraid. So I want to melt the ice cube. And the way I'm going to melt the ice cube is I need to subtract some of the coldness from it. So with this, I'm at -3, but I need to subtract enough to melt the ice cube. Now 0 is freezing point, so let's take it to 1. So I need to take out 4 degrees of cold value, and that's -4. And by doing that, by taking out those 4 degrees of coldness, I'm actually increasing the heat. I'm adding warmth. So my -3 degrees centigrade ice cube, which was here, has had 4 degrees of warmth added onto it now because I've taken 4 degrees of coldness out. So I've gone 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will now be at 1 degree centigrade. And the theory there that's worth making a note of, and that is subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. Now let's move on to some more advanced negative number skills. Even if you're further ahead in maths and you're finding you're getting the odd question wrong, particularly with negative numbers, I used to, and it was these kind of questions that used to stump me, particularly this last one at the end. Anyway, let's look at the first one. We have +5, we have a negative, and then we have a bracket with x plus 2. Now we can't collect, we can't add that x and 2. If you're doing algebra, you would know that they have to stay separate from each other. But what does this negative and this bracket say? Well, what we've learnt before, we know that there is an invisible multiplication sign there. So this is telling us to multiply everything in this bracket by the negative sign. So we have to multiply the positive x first, and then the second time we will have to multiply the negative by this +2. And if we go ahead and do that, the 5, nothing's changed there, that stays the same. And then we have negative multiplied by a positive x, and that will give you the negative. Then put the x in. And now we'll do the next one, and that is the negative multiplied by the +2. Negative multiplied by a positive, that's a negative, and that would give us 2. Now we can go ahead and further simplify this because we have a +5, we have a -2, and they're both number terms, so we can collect them. So 5 take away 2, that gives us 3 minus x. That's your final answer. Now let's look at the next one. There we are, I've moved that over there. So what do we have here? Well, this is a classic double brackets, which will result in a quadratic expression. And what we're being asked to do here is everything in this bracket must be multiplied by everything in this bracket. And we know this from what I explained earlier, and that is whenever you have something next to a bracket, there's an invisible multiplication sign there. I will post another video on multiplying out brackets, but just to give you a quick run through, what we do here is we take the first term in the first bracket, which is x, and we need to multiply it by the first term in the second bracket. That's the first step. Then we would take the same term and we will multiply it by the second term in the second bracket. Once we've we've done those two, we're going to take this -4, the second term in the first bracket, multiply it by the first term in the second bracket. And lastly, we're going to multiply the -4 by the +3. You notice it looks a little bit like a crab claw or lobster claw. So let's go ahead and do that. And obviously we need to focus that we're getting the negative numbers right. So firstly, this one, x times x, and that gave us x squared. Then we had x multiplied by +3, that gave us +3x. Then we had -4 multiplied by +x. So we did the sign first. Negative times a positive is a negative. 4 times x is 4x. And lastly, we have -4 multiplied by +3. Sign first, a negative multiplied by a positive is a negative, and 4 multiplied by 3 is 12. We can go ahead and collect the like terms. That's going to be the 3x and the -4x in the middle. So you rewrite this as x squared. That stays the same. Now we have +3x minus 4x. And that's just normal subtraction. So that's 3 take away 4. There's no unusual negative rules here. And that will give us -1, but we don't write the 1 in algebra, we just write x. There is an invisible 1 there. And lastly, you have -12. And that's fully simplified. Now the last one, this was the one that used to trip me up, and it does with many students. Here we have a quadratic expression here and a quadratic expression here. This is actually from another video. I will link it at the end. Firstly, we want to get rid of the brackets. Before we do any subtracting, we'll eliminate the brackets. Now the first bracket, that can go. We don't have to change anything there. 2y squared minus 7y plus 3. Second bracket, that's a little trickier because this negative here, there is an invisible multiplication sign there. So we have to multiply everything in that bracket by that negative sign before we can move the bracket. This is the point that most people get wrong. So here, there's the invisible multiplication sign. A negative sign is next to a bracket. So firstly, we have negative multiplied by +y squared. That's going to give you -y squared. Next one, negative multiplied by -2y. That's going to give you +2y. And lastly, negative multiplied by a +1. That will give you a -1. Now you can go ahead and simplify the whole expression. So first we look at the squared terms. We have 2 of them. So we have 2y squared minus y squared. That gives us y squared, +y squared I should highlight. So we have a -7y plus 2y, and that will give you -5y. And lastly, +3 and a -1, so that's 3 take away 1, and that gives you +2. And that should be about everything. I hope this video really helped. If it did, hit the subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.